I never wanted to join a dating app. Friends had urged me for months, insisting it was the easiest way to meet people in today's world. Against my better judgment, I caved. Setting up the profile felt tedious and oddly invasive, but I told myself it was harmless. Within a few days, I matched with Dan. He seemed friendly and polite, his profile filled with standard photos of hikes and coffee cups. Nothing particularly exciting, but not alarming either. Our first date was in a casual cafe near my neighborhood. It was fine, just fine. Dan talked a lot, mostly about himself, but there was no spark. By the end of the evening, I already knew I wouldn't see him again. As we parted ways, he lingered a little too long, giving me an intense look that made me uncomfortable. I chalked it up to awkwardness and told myself it was no big deal. That night, as I got ready for bed, my phone buzzed. It was Dan, thanking me for the date. His enthusiasm felt disproportionate to how the night had gone, but I replied politely, keeping my tone neutral. When I turned off my phone, I felt relieved, certain that tomorrow I could put the whole experience behind me. The next morning, my phone erupted with messages. Dan had sent over a dozen texts within an hour, each more insistent than the last. They started friendly, asking how I slept, but quickly became demanding, questioning why I hadn't responded. I felt a knot of discomfort tightening in my stomach. I ignored them, hoping he'd lose interest. Instead, the tone of his messages shifted. By noon, he was accusing me of leading him on and wasting his time. When I finally blocked his number, I felt a brief wave of relief, believing I had solved the problem. That relief was short-lived. Later that day, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was a detailed description of my outfit from the night before. My heart sank. How could he have known my exact appearance? The realization that he might have watched me after the date sent a chill through me. That evening, as I glanced out my window, I saw a jogger pass by my house. My heart stopped when I recognized Dan. He was running, his eyes fixed ahead, but his presence so close to my home made my skin crawl. I couldn't prove it was intentional, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. The following days were a blur of anxiety. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a surge of panic, half expecting another message from an unknown number. Blocking him hadn't stopped him. He kept finding ways to contact me, each message more unnerving than the last. Some were cryptic and unsettling, just my name repeated. Others were explicit threats, telling me I'd regret ignoring him. The messages felt invasive, like he'd breached a wall I didn't even know I had. Then came the photos. The first one was of my car, parked outside my house. It was taken at night, the dim light of a street lamp barely illuminating the outline of the vehicle. The second was of my front door, slightly ajar as I had left it earlier that day. The realization that he had been near my home, close enough to take these pictures, made my blood run cold. He was watching me. That night, as I sat on the couch with the blinds tightly shut, I heard a noise. A sharp scraping sound broke the stillness. I froze, listening, heart pounding, until I gathered the courage to look. A man was at my window, his hands pressed against the glass, trying to slide it open. I screamed, and he bolted, disappearing into the darkness. I couldn't prove it was Dan, but I didn't need to. The fear was confirmation enough. The next morning, I reported everything to the police. I showed them the threatening messages, the photos, and recounted the attempted break-in. They listened politely, but didn't seem particularly alarmed. "We'll keep an eye on it," they said, handing me a list of general safety tips. It felt inadequate, but I tried to follow their advice, locking all my windows, keeping lights on, and staying vigilant. The messages didn't stop. If anything, they grew bolder. He described what I was wearing on specific days, times when I'd been out running errands. The realization that he was actively following me wherever I went was suffocating. One message stood out. "It's only a matter of time." That was the moment I knew I needed more than just a report filed. I began meticulously documenting everything, screenshots, timestamps, and photos of his messages. When I presented the updated evidence to the police, their tone shifted. They agreed to issue a restraining order, warning Dan to stay away under threat of legal consequences. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that this nightmare might end. The harassment stopped as suddenly as it had begun. After the restraining order was issued, there were no more messages, no photos, no unexpected joggers outside my house. At first, I didn't trust the silence, living in a constant state of hyper-awareness, expecting him to reappear at any moment. But days turned into weeks, and eventually, life began to return to a fragile semblance of normal. I deleted my dating profile, wiping away any trace of the app that had introduced me to Dan. The thought of trusting someone new felt impossible, the memory of his fixation too fresh. Even the sound of a text notification still set my heart racing, a small reminder of the power he had taken from me. I never heard from Dan again, and for that, I was grateful. But the experience left scars, tiny fractures in my sense of security that would take years to mend. I avoided dating apps entirely, preferring the safety of distance. It wasn't fear that drove my decision, but a simple certainty. Some things are better left undiscovered. Moving to a new city was meant to be a fresh start. I had left behind a familiar yet stagnant routine, hoping to meet new people and make my life a bit more exciting. Tinder seemed like an easy way to jumpstart that process. It didn't take long before I matched with someone intriguing, a woman with a mysterious, artsy vibe. Her profile was filled with cryptic captions, abstract paintings, and photos of her posing dramatically under moody lighting. I was intrigued. Her messages were short but thoughtful, and I decided to meet her in person. The evening started off strangely. When I pulled up to her place, she came out quickly but didn't head to the passenger side as expected. Instead, she walked to the driver's side, standing uncomfortably close as if she was studying me. Her gaze was blank, her face unreadable, and she didn't say a word. I smiled awkwardly and gestured toward the passenger door. She finally moved but lingered as she got in, her movements slow and deliberate. I tried to shrug it off as nerves. At the bar, her quirks became more apparent. She whispered when she spoke, forcing me to lean in to catch her words. Despite this, her conversation was engaging, and I found myself drawn to her peculiar charm. She spoke about art, spirituality, and her love of nature in a way that felt genuine, even if a bit unusual. By the end of the night, I decided to invite her back to my place. It seemed harmless enough at the time. I had no idea what I was setting myself up for. The oddness began almost as soon as we stepped through my front door. As she looked around, her eyes fixated on my bookshelf, then the small trinkets scattered on my coffee table. She picked up a bracelet I'd left there, holding it delicately before turning to me with a serious expression. "This reminds me of my jewelry," she said softly, tracing the bracelet with her finger. "You know, the pieces I inherited from my past life, when I was Anastasia." At first, I thought she was joking, but her tone didn't match. She explained with absolute conviction that she was Anastasia Romanov, the Russian princess. Her jewelry, she claimed, was a secret link to her royal identity, a connection only those with the right energy could understand. I stared at her, unsure how to respond, until curiosity got the better of me. "How do you know?" I asked, careful to keep my voice neutral. Her face twisted in anger. "You doubt me?" she snapped, her voice suddenly loud and harsh. Before I could react, she lunged at me, grabbing me by the neck. "You'll regret mocking me," she hissed, her nails digging into my skin. "I'm a shaman. I can curse you." My heart raced as I froze in place, unsure if moving would escalate her anger further. She grabbed a whiskey glass from the table, dipped her finger in the remnants of the drink, and traced a cross on my face. "You're blessed now," she muttered, her mood abruptly shifting. She leaned in, kissing my forehead with an unsettling gentleness before releasing me. I stood there, stunned, as she wandered into the living room, dropping to all fours and crawling like a cat. "I love cats," she purred, arching her back in an exaggerated motion. "Sometimes, I feel like I am one." The sight was surreal, a sharp contrast to the charm she'd displayed at the bar. Every instinct told me to ask her to leave, but I couldn't figure out how to do so without provoking her further. As she prowled around my living room on all fours, I stood frozen, my mind racing to piece together what was happening. The absurdity of the situation left me stunned, but her unpredictable behavior made it clear I needed to remain calm. She eventually stood, scanning my shelves and countertops like she was looking for something. Her eyes landed on a bundle of sage tucked in the corner of my kitchen, a small part of my personal ritual for clearing my space. "You have sage," she said, her tone sharp and accusatory, as if I'd been hiding it from her. We need to burn it, right now. She grabbed it without waiting for permission, her movements frantic. This house needs a blessing, or you'll be cursed. Do you want to be cursed? She demanded, her voice rising with each word. I stepped forward quickly, taking the sage from her hands. No, that's personal, I said firmly, trying to sound calm. She didn't take it well. Her face twisted with rage, and she screamed, a guttural, piercing sound that echoed through the room. You're a horrible person, she yelled, her words barely coherent through her fury. She threw her arms up dramatically, storming toward the door and slamming it behind her. I stood in the sudden silence, my heart pounding. Relief washed over me for a brief moment, but it was short-lived. Less than 5 minutes later, there was a loud, insistent banging on my door. Open up! I left my phone! She screamed from the hallway. The banging grew louder, more frantic, each thud making me flinch. I opened the door a crack, just enough to hand her the phone I'd spotted on the couch. She snatched it from my hand, but as I tried to close the door, she pushed against it with surprising force. Her face was wild with anger, and my stomach dropped when I saw something gleam in her hand, what looked like a knife. It was small, barely more than a pocket blade, but the sight of it sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I slammed the door shut with all my strength, locking it quickly as she screamed from the other side. Her voice was shrill, a mix of rage and desperation, as she pounded on the door with her fists. You don't understand, she wailed. You'll regret this. I backed away, shaking, my mind racing with every possible scenario of what she might do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. I listened closely, my ear pressed to the door, until I heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway. Even then, I didn't dare move for several minutes, waiting to make sure she was really gone. When I finally looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every car passing outside, sent waves of anxiety through me. I double-checked the locks on my door, replaying the evening's events over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of her face, her erratic expressions shifting from calm to furious in an instant. The knife she'd held, the bizarre threats, her screams, they all haunted me long after she'd left. For days, I kept expecting her to return. Each time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I braced myself, convinced it was her. She never came back, but the fear lingered, a constant reminder of how close I had come to real danger. I deleted Tinder the next day, swearing off dating apps altogether. Though life eventually returned to normal, the memory of her remains vivid. I hope she found whatever peace she seemed so desperately to need, but I also hope I never cross paths with her again. After my breakup, I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a distraction to ease the sting of loneliness. Tinder seemed like an easy way to meet people without much commitment. It wasn't long before Pete popped up. His profile was full of confidence, his smile disarming. He seemed different from the usual faces I'd been swiping past, and his messages were funny, charming, and attentive. He asked about my interests, complimented my taste in music, and made me laugh in a way I hadn't in weeks. We met for coffee a few days later. Pete was just as personable in person, maybe even more so. He seemed genuinely interested in me, asking about my hobbies and work. Though he talked about himself a bit too much, I chalked it up to nerves. By the end of the date, I wasn't smitten, but I wasn't opposed to seeing him again either. He seemed safe, normal. But the next few days revealed a side of Pete I wasn't expecting. He texted constantly, far more than I was used to, and his questions about my daily routine grew more specific. When I mentioned I was heading out for drinks with friends, he casually asked which bar I was going to. I didn't think much of it at the time, brushing it off as friendly curiosity. I didn't realize I'd just given him more information than I should have. The second date was when things started to shift. Pete insisted on driving me to a restaurant I'd chosen. I was hesitant, but eventually agreed, figuring it would be fine. But as the evening went on, he grew more intrusive. He asked where I lived, jokingly saying he could drop me off right at my door. I laughed it off, giving a vague response, but he pressed further, trying to guess the area based on clues from our conversation. His persistence was unsettling, though he always masked it behind an easygoing demeanor. Midway through the date, Pete answered a call. His tone changed immediately, hushed, defensive, and tense. Though I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, it was clear whoever was on the line was angry. When he hung up, he waved it off, muttering something about drama with an old roommate. I didn't ask for details, but the moment stuck with me. Later that week, Pete showed up uninvited at a cafe I'd mentioned I liked, claiming it was a coincidence. He acted like it was sweet, but I felt a pang of unease. When I tried to create distance, he ignored my hints, doubling down on his requests to come over to my place. His behavior wasn't outright threatening yet, but it was enough to make me start dreading our interactions. The final straw came during what would be our last encounter. Pete had convinced me to meet him for a casual lunch, promising to keep things light and easy. I didn't feel excited, but I agreed, hoping to end things on amicable terms. As soon as I arrived, I knew something was wrong. His usual charm was absent, replaced by an intensity that felt suffocating. He brought up his living situation, hinting at issues with his roommate, and quickly transitioned into complaining about not having a stable place to stay. I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but Pete pressed on, his voice growing sharper. "You have a nice place, don't you?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes too focused. I froze, unsure how to respond. When I brushed it off, his frustration surfaced. He accused me of being selfish, of not caring about anyone but myself. The sudden shift in his demeanor sent a jolt of fear through me. The tension escalated as he continued his tirade, leaning in closer, his voice low and angry. My instincts screamed at me to leave. When he paused to check his phone, I seized the moment, excusing myself under the pretense of needing the restroom. Instead, I walked straight out the door, heart pounding, and hurried back to my apartment. As I entered the complex, I felt a surge of panic, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me. I rushed to a neighbor's door, knocking frantically until they let me in. Inside the safety of my neighbor's apartment, I locked the door behind me and called for help. My hands shook as I blocked Pete on every platform, deleting all traces of our conversations and ensuring he couldn't contact me again. The relief was immediate, but the fear lingered. I couldn't shake the thought of how close I'd come to letting him manipulate me further. Later that evening, I replayed the events in my mind, piecing together the red flags I'd ignored or dismissed. His probing questions, his insistence on knowing where I lived, the suspicious phone call. It all pointed to someone who had been trying to wedge his way into my life for his own gain. The realization hit me like a wave. Pete wasn't just clingy or intense. He had been calculating, pushing boundaries with the goal of securing a place to stay. Whether it was desperation or something darker, I would never know. For weeks after the encounter, I felt uneasy in my own home. Every knock at the door or unfamiliar sound sent my heart racing. I deleted Tinder, unable to stomach the thought of meeting someone new. The experience had drained me of trust, leaving me hyper-aware of how easily someone could present a false version of themselves. Eventually, life settled back into a routine, but I carried the memory of Pete with me like a shadow. The thought of his calculating persistence served as a reminder to trust my instincts and protect my boundaries at all costs. Though the fear subsided with time, the lesson remained. Not every charming smile hides good intentions. Sometimes it conceals something far more dangerous.